safety is not going to be a one-size-fits-all property. Safety on one platform is going to look very differently than safety on another platform, and that's desirable, right? What children face online right now, the state of the threat is so far ahead from the current state of the defenses. We know the defenses are brittle. We know the defenses are hypercentralized. We know the defenses are not accessible to the people who want them. And open source is also a hack to build faster together.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
This week's guest is Camille François, who came to us from Brooklyn. She is an expert in trust and safety across the internet. She's had some amazing roles in her career, and I know you'll tell us more about those in a moment. The other thing is that they've, together with a team, have recently launched a nonprofit called ROOST with the aim of ensuring that anybody has access to trust and safety tools. It doesn't have to just be that you have a big budget to spend. You also ask us some very large questions like, how do we democratize safety on the internet? So tell me a little bit about Camille and why you wanted to bring her onto the podcast.
Camille is a real expert in the world of trust and safety, in the world of understanding the way in which humanity gets together and collaborates. And she has been working at taking the tools out of big tech companies and making them available to everyone and building an open source ecosystem around supporting this. And she's also an expert in the way in which AI is getting adopted. So we talk about the implications of AI and the connection between how we thought about social media having the impact on the society and AI, and what is a team human solution? What is a way in which we can build this all to collaborate together? It was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and I think her optimism and her enthusiasm, despite having seen some of the worst things on the internet, is also really infectious. And, I think we have to have hope that there are better ways of doing things in our social communities online. And I know that's what drives you every day as well. So let's take a listen.
Today I have Camille François, the founding president of ROOST. She is a leading researcher and technologist in the development of trust and safety technology. ROOST provides open source trust and safety tools so that everybody who builds these platforms are able to do it. She's a faculty affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, professor of practice at Columbia, and someone who has been working in industry and as a researcher on this stuff. And so, she ran trust and safety at Niantic as the chief innovation officer at Graphica. They looked at disinformation, they looked at government interference, they looked at ways in which people are trying to control or corrupt the social media ecosystem and the internet in general. She spent some time at Google with the Jigsaw team and has been on lots of government commissions around the world. So welcome, Camille.
Thank you for having me.
I think the most interesting thing of the timing of this conversation is I've had two threads of emails going back and forth with the team at ROOST. One thread is about getting you on this podcast and what the things we can talk about and the commentary of what we're doing. And then the other thread is I have Divine, my social video app, which needs all of your tools. So I think that's a great place to start to say, what is ROOST and what are you doing? Since I'm very excitedly implementing and using some of them, and I want to share that with the world.
Oh, thank you for saying that, Rebel. We're very excited that you are using the ROOST tools. So at the sort of more simple version, ROOST is a nonprofit that works with a lot of partners, some philanthropic organizations, some tech companies, some open source projects, and some civil society organizations to create a commons of robust open source safety tools. We can talk about how we landed on that conclusion that the world needed a shared commons of open source safety tools, but sort of each letter in ROOST matters. ROOST stands for Robust Open Online Safety Tools. And it starts with R because they are real robust tools. They're not like small prototypes that people have never, deployed at scale. If you look at our current projects, one of them is a rules engine called Osprey. It was Discord's own rules engine. So we know that it scales. We know that it can handle really complex safety issues. Another one of our projects is Reasoning, bring your own policy model that was contributed by OpenAI. It's their own model. It's a core part of their own safety infrastructure. And then another one is a review tool called Coop. And this one we actually acquired. It's a fun story, but it was a real robust tool that was used by several serious tech companies, notably to handle child safety issues.
So we have so much in the news about child safety issues. We have so much where people are concerned about it. There's a movement like Australia, which just is attempting to block kids under 16 from using social media by listing just specific apps they're blocking. I don't think that is the way to do it, but I really want to, rather than jumping straight into that argument, I want to talk about how do you engage with making a world safe for people online? How do we make space for kids? How do we understand what it is? What is it to do trust and safety, and how do you implement it?
Yeah, easy question, Rabble.
Yeah.
So we put under the umbrella of child safety a lot of different issues that need to be tackled sort of sometimes separately, right? Child sexual exploitation is unfortunately exploding in volume. All the credible reports that are tracking child sexual exploitation online are confirming that. There's a lot of AI-generated child sexual exploitation. There are dangerous groups that are trading in these materials and pushing kids to self-harm. There's a huge issue around tech and mental health. There are issues around eating disorder and self-image. And so this sort of like, first there's a bucket of different threats that kids are facing online. The reality is, on some of these threats, we are very much behind on ensuring that we have the technological defenses that are needed to tackle this problem correctly. So I will talk, for instance, about child sexual abuse material, CSAM. A lot of regulators that we talk to have said, we want to really raise the floor for what people need to do to prevent their platforms from hosting child sexual abuse material, which in many markets, many jurisdictions is illegal material. The reality is today there are no simple tools that are affordable and accessible that people can use when they are coming to the issue and saying, oh, actually, we care about doing the right thing, right? This remains way too complicated for everyday builders and frankly from some, medium-sized platform to actually access and implement.
There's not an easy place I can go and say, here, I can't run it all myself. We're using large platforms like Cloudflare, like Google, because they provide those services.
Yeah, and perhaps that's a good thing, right? Like what we want is sort of to encourage those platforms to actually share those mature technologies, but for everybody to be able to access them, and frankly for free, right? So grooming is also a type of threat that is absolutely, unfortunately, on the rise, difficult to detect, for which we need to have better technology in this shared commons of tech. So to answer your question, there's a lot of different types of issues in what we call child safety. There's a lot of different types of threats. I understand why people are increasingly concerned while you see regulators moving to what you're saying, right? Like wholesale bans. There's still so much that is preventable that we can and should focus on if we want to make a dent on these issues.
So you've worked inside a bunch of these companies. You've looked systemically, you've studied it at Graphica. Niantic, obviously, is this massively social video game where you're in the real world. Jigsaw is a very interesting innovation lab inside Google around trying to solve big society's problems. Sort of what distinguishes healthy digital ecosystems, healthy spaces from unhealthy ones? Like, how do we, what makes them healthier?
That's a great question. I think, some of that is virtue of what the caretakers of the space want and do about this, right? Like how much you invest in the health and safety of your users, who are your users, what type of threats they may be facing. I think the important part of this is that safety is not going to be a one-size-fits-all property. Safety on one platform is going to look very differently than safety on another platform, and that's desirable, right? When we started looking at the sort of beginning of the space of trust and safety, it was the case that there were a handful of large social platforms that had trust and safety teams, and very much like, this is how rules should look like. And we have no idea how any of these platforms implement those rules. But I think, now there's a wider recognition that pluralism in safety is highly desirable. What you want is many different online spaces that are going to be governed by different rules. And of course, you want a little bit more transparency on how those rules are enforced.
That's, I think, so interesting because when Jack announced the formation of what eventually became Blue Sky, he said that one of the reasons they were doing it was not just open source or a protocol or a network or because he wanted to, compete with a potential future Elon Musk buying Twitter. That one of the things was he didn't like the fact that he had been put in the position of the decider, the person who had to decide whether or not Trump had an account, the single person that was ultimately in charge of all the trustee safety things. And you're talking about a pluralistic sort of a multi-aspected in which there are many different players, many different providers is super interesting. In the Blue Sky ecosystem, you can choose. They have this thing called composable moderation. You can choose where you do your moderation. Do you choose the Black Sky moderation or the Blue Sky one or Gander, which will give you just like a Canadian centric version of it? And we're trying to implement that in Divine. But when I went to go look at it and say, okay, I want to do this, I didn't find any tools. Black Sky has had to sort of build all of their tools from scratch. And that's a lot of what Roost is doing. Tell me a little more about this open, this multitude, this different ways of doing it so that we have different spaces.
Rabble, what you're pointing to is that sort of customization of safety will happen in different places of the stack, right? So if I look at my Columbia students today, for instance, and we talk about where they live their digital lives, they will talk about many more platforms than the students from 10 years ago, right? So maybe students from 10 years ago would go have their conversations with their family on Facebook Messenger, but also follow their neighborhood news on the same place and also get their political news, somewhere else, right? There were a handful of platforms. Today, I think a lot of folks report I would go for Blue Sky for my political news, and I'm communicating with my family on WhatsApp, and the student group is a Discord server, and I'm using Signal for X, right? So there's sort of safety pluralism because there are a lot more different online spaces. That's also going to happen with AI, right? You're going to have different types of AI applications with different types of safeguards because they make sense for different use cases. And what you're talking about is user level safety controls, right? On one platform, the user being able to say, well, I'm going to use the same platform than my neighbor, but I'm going to decide that I want to see a different set of contents. The good news is, with all this pluralism, there's still sort of a core set of safety tools that people need to do this personalization work. Some of that, I think, is up to the user, as you said, right? You could decide that today you want to see more political news or less political news. And then some of that, I think, will be more on the platform side. So if, for instance, it's likely the case that all of these different platforms want to remove child sexual abuse material completely and not leave that decision to the user for many obvious reasons.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. There's some of these things that we have agreed as a society that we don't want because consuming them and making them available drives people to engage in unacceptable harm on especially children. But so many of the other decisions are so nuanced.
Yeah, And I think that's why we want people to be able to personalize these safeguards, right? So Roost is based on the idea of open source. Our work is open source, and what that means in practice is essentially the idea of the four freedoms, right? If you want to go back to sort of classic free software idea, right? You have a freedom to use a program and to say, actually, I'm going to build my own platform like you did, and I want to use this for free. You have a freedom to study a program. You're like, actually, I'm a user of this platform, and I'd like to understand how moderation is done. That impacts my speech. I'm just going to go and audit that. You have a freedom to modify it. You're going to say, actually, this is a nice program. It's either a nice classifier or a nice rules engine or a console. My use case is slightly different, so I'm going to adapt it. Maybe you're adapting it for your community. Maybe you're adapting it for your language. And then you have a right to redistribute it, right? Like once you've adapted a piece of safety, maybe so that it works really well in your context, you want to be able to redistribute it and let other people use your version. That's, I think, the freedoms that we are building in the infrastructure, that shared commons of safety tools. I think what's exciting is we're building that with many other users, right? Like with the tech companies, with the civil society groups, with the open source
engaging in co-design with the users doing it with the larger community, as opposed to saying, oh, trust and safety happens sort of in a back room where no one knows who's doing it. We don't get to participate in those discussions.
Yeah, the thing that's really encouraging is there are different ways in which we're seeing that there are a lot of people who are ready for that, right? Initially, we thought, I don't know how many people are going to come and co-design these tools with us. We just hosted a hackathon with Hugging Face and OpenAI in San Francisco, and there were many organizations, very diverse set of organizations who showed up, and they all had very different safety use cases, right? Because again, to our point, like safety will look different in many different contexts. And so they were very keen to jump in and then to do some building together. Similarly, we just released our short-term roadmap and we said, okay, community, tell us how we should navigate this one. Let's co-build this together.
So much of what open source and free software does is this inverting the idea of the organization, the idea that we should work in the open, that we should work in a network. When I built Divine as a one-person project, hacking on it, and then I announced it, and then the world started paying attention to it, and hundreds of thousands of people tried to use it. And my solution was okay, let me use this network. Let me reach out to all these people who, by the structure of it, can contribute. Your stuff on the four freedoms of free software, I think, is really important. It's the basis by which we have the internet that works. I mean, yes, we have proprietary software. Yes, we have big companies, but even the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, 99% of what they're doing, 99% of what they use and they build is built on this free software. It's built on this open source. And so like the internet we have today could not exist without it. And so I was looking at how people are concerned about social media. And I was looking at Blue Sky, and I was looking at Nostr, and I was looking at Mastodon, and I was all these things. And I said, okay, what distinguishes them from the previous things? How are they different? And they're not, they are open source, and they have some things that users understand, like, Blue Sky lets you do algorithm choice and moderation choice. But I said, can we have freedoms like that? And so I laid out these like bill of rights for social media. Users should have privacy and security. They should have ownership of their own identity and their contacts and their content. There should be interoperability and the right to exit. We should have algorithmic control and transparency. You get to say, not that there won't be algorithms, you say, and we need the right to self-governance. Nathan Schneider talks about how there's more democracy in any garden club than an online forum. And so it's like the bowling league is more democratic than so much of the internet. And so it's not like we humans don't know how to do this stuff. It's that we didn't design it this way.
I mean, to your point, a lot of the sort of modern architecture of computing is heavily built on free software and open source. And a lot of the sister fields of safety rely on a shared infrastructure of open source tools. So cybersecurity, for instance, as a field, has this very strong common core of open source safety tools. And what's interesting in the example of cybersecurity is that it shows you that It's not either you have vendors and a business, or you have, a hippie commons of safety tools. One enables the other, right? It enables everybody to collaborate. It enables interoperability. It enables vendors to actually have an easier time to sell because people have a joint infrastructure to integrate into. And so if we sort of remember the history of the internet, of the web, of AI, we understand the fundamental role that open source can play in accelerating innovation, right? And that's really what we need in safety is when we look at the state of the threats. Children was a good example, right? Like what children face online right now, the state of the threat is so far ahead from the current state of the defenses. We know the defenses are brittle. We know the defenses are hypercentralized. We know the defenses are not accessible to the people who want them. And open source is also a hack to build faster together, transparently, and to sort of like do some of the catching up that we need to do in this industry, really.
Yeah, because we've opened up this internet that empowered the entire world to communicate and connect. And we don't have the social institutions. I talked to Jeff Jarvis, who's, does the history of the printing press and the emergence of that. And he talked about how when the movable type press got created, we didn't have concepts of editors and chapters and all of these things that we needed to make sense of the printing press. And in order to really use it, we like this new technology we developed. And I think that we need to build that. And your talk about the open source commons is so important. I had David Bollier, who's author of a bunch of books like Think Like a Commoner on. And what people think is they think a commons is something where you can't do business. They think a commons is something where there are no rules. And that is not the case. So much of the internet we have today is a commons. The entire world of open source technology we created is a commons. And so many important businesses can contribute to that and do business within the space of this commons. And that's the only way we're going to tackle these sort of global problems.
Yeah, and if you look at the long arc of tech, the social media era is the exception, not the rule, right? Like the internet was built on common technology, on open source, on free software. The web was very much built on these premises, right? Tim Berners-Lee just published an autobiography called This Is for Everyone, where he explains all the technical choices that made the web what it is. And, you couldn't argue that there were no businesses made on the web, right? Like this, obviously. And then the reality is the safety infrastructure that we have today, we inherited from that moment, which is the social media moment. That's why it's so hyper-centralized. That's why it's so opaque. That's why it's so brittle. And what we're doing is we're bringing back those age-old principles of if you want to innovate faster, if you want pluralism, if you want trust, right? If you want people to be able to audit what's going on, we do it the open source way. That's how we build the internet. That's how we build the web. And that's how we're going to build the future of where we're heading, right? So yeah, we've inherited a generation of technology that didn't come from the best part of our technological arc, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the reason I'm doing this podcast and I'm talking to everyone is trying to figure out what happened. Because in Web 2.0 in 2004, 2005, 2006, that era of Web 2.0, it felt like this part of the open commons, this participatory, we make websites accessible, user content, is participating, Time Magazine had Person of the Year and it was you. And we had this moment where it felt like, yes, we were continuing to work within this commons, within this space. And then we ended up building a set of technologies and a set of businesses that took away from that commons. They enclosed it and they made a tremendous amount of money, and still make a tremendous amount of money by using algorithms to show us which ads we're going to do, and by clicking it, and by building off these walled gardens. And I think trust and safety as a field grew up in that era where these companies weren't just trying to, they weren't just trying to make safe spaces for things, but they were also in some ways trying to make spaces, digital spaces that are open to participation, but safe for advertisers, because that's a lot of the regulation is, who is paying the bills. And so it's so interesting, your work of trying to take that knowledge, the good stuff in there, and bring it out to everyone.
We did learn a few things. And so I'm not saying that like everything we learned in the early days of trust and safety, needs to go away, right? Like it's a baby in a bathwater situation.
Yeah.
But we do need to upgrade our safety OS, for today's world. And it's interesting because people think about AI a lot, right? Like, what has AI changed in safety? And there's sort of like 99 million things written about like, oh, it brings new safety threats. That's true. It brings new safety defenses. Also true. You could sort of like play that game. The thing that I think it's easy to forget is it brings a lot more new players, right? Suddenly you have an enormous amount of builders who are like, hey, actually, we want safety tech. That wasn't the case 10 years ago, right? And I think that new demand for people who want to build safer spaces, are doing new types of platforms, or doing new types of products, are willing to iterate, are willing to contribute back, also is a great infusion of energy and perspectives into the safety field. And that's desirable, right? It's great that there are many new people coming online saying like, hey, I'm building a little thing here and a little thing there, and I'm building faster, and I have a new alternative platform. That part's also exciting.
It's difficult to remember how hard it was to build new apps and platforms a decade ago. It's not that long ago, but it required many orders of magnitude more work. And there was no effective way to get people to use it because things had been sort of closed off. And now we have this weird thing in AI where so many people see AI as this thing that's being shoved down their throats. They see it as, Peter Thiel and Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg and, Elon Musk, who want to be sort of authoritarian masters of the universe of our digital spaces and, fantasize of going off and creating island utopias, or new cities in California where they can, engage in technological determinism. If you only see that, you're like,
you want to unplug everything.
AI nightmare. Like, why should we accept this thing? But you're also seeing the open source part of it. You're seeing the world of people collaborating. They're seeing the world of people building stuff. Not all of these AI systems are built in that way that create a centralized control. And as people explore, Hugging Face is a great example of this, is a community platform exploring. They need these tools as well. And they don't necessarily have the resources of the big companies. I wonder if you could talk about sort of AI and the way in which AI is getting rolled out and how you're seeing the community of people building many things.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is so true, right? Like depending on what you're looking at, you see a very different face of AI. I spent a bit of time working on that community of open source AI and trying to figure out, like, bringing everybody together, trying to define, like, well, how do you define open source in the context of AI, right? Because open source has a fairly clear definition when you apply it to a normal software stack. It gets a bit more interesting when you think about an AI system, right? Not just the model, not just the weight, but the whole system. What I learned doing this work with the community, not only with the Mozilla Foundation and with a lot of people who we sort of like brought along to say, okay, let's gather the open source AI community, is that it has great diversity, right? It's a lot of people who are building a lot of different things. You have scientists, you have schools, you have little nonprofits, you have journalists, and they build big things and small things and local things, right? And I find it particularly joyful to look at the diversity and dynamism of that, of some of the open source AI community, for sure. And when we started working on this, it was around the time of the first AI Safety Summit in the UK. I came to the AI Safety Summit in Bletchley Park, and I was confused a bit by a sort of vibe that a lot of people said there's the responsible safety AI labs, hypercentralized, the big ones. And then there's the totally irresponsible open source AI people who are on the other side of safety. And so we were like, okay, wait a minute, what? Actually, in the history of tech, right? What we've learned is that open source, when it comes to safety and security, is not a poison, it's an antidote. And we did a little bit of work, again, like convening with the community and a lot of smart labs and smart researchers to think about, well, what do we need to ensure that the open source values get translated in open source, the safety values get translated in open source AI too, right? Like, again, that pluralism, that auditability, that transparency, right? That open source has so much to contribute to safety for accelerating innovation, for accelerating trust, for people being able to, again, adapt those tools to their own communities, their own context. And so we did a little bit of catching up. There was an open letter, there was a series of convenings, there was a roadmap. And I think that, that was a great thing that out of one of the many threads that led into the founding of Roost a few years later at the Paris AI Action Summit.
It reminds me so much. There's such interesting parallels between the evolution of social media and the potential evolution of AI. You know, there was a moment in which Zuckerberg and Facebook was like, just trust us, put all your content on our platform. Media companies come in, you can trust us. And then you get an Enshittification, sort of Cory Doctorow's wonderfully eloquent critique of what happens when concept. You get put in there and then it's great at first, and then they close everything off and they lock you in with a kind of choke point capitalism, and then everything gets shitty. And with AI models, especially the big companies, a lot of them are making the argument that if you just open it up to everyone, if you make it open source, people will use it for every bad thing possible. You know, you will get deep fake porn if you don't use it through their servers. And so as an advocate for open source, as an advocate for things not being controlled by fluid platforms, how do we design systems and models to understand that? And as open source contributors, where we don't control how people use the things we're releasing in the world, how do we make sure that they're better? Because there's so many open source licenses or open source like licenses, which says, don't do this for harmful things. And it's incompatible with the freedoms of free software. But you're an open source company trying to make trust and safety work, and trust and safety for these emerging AI. What do we do?
So we're a nonprofit. That matters a great deal. But you're right. So I think that it's easy to say, listen, we're worried about all the bad things that can be created with AI, and therefore we should only trust the AI that's hyper-centralized, that people can't adapt themselves. The people who looked into that, there was a fantastic Stanford paper who sort of thought about, okay, well, how do we sort of address thoughtfully some of these risks, have put forth the sort of first principle, which is you need to look at the marginal risk, right? Like, you can't just pin all the bad things that could go wrong with AI on open source. You have to think about what's the actual marginal risk, the increase that the open source system creates. And when you sort of espouse that mindset, first you recognize that a lot of things that could go wrong with AI are going wrong with AI on closed systems too, right? And that maybe this should interrogate us on why don't we have better systems in place writ large, right?
Yeah.
And then when you think about okay, well, let's think about these threats, right? So deepfake, for instance, nudifying apps, right?
Yeah.
Horrible threats, multiplication of nudifying apps. People who work on tracking those nudifying apps, they will tell you, well, the problem is you can download it on the App Store, which you shouldn't. That's against their terms of services. The problem is that those services are advertised on search engines, You shouldn't be able to find them there. That's against the terms of services. You can find ads for those nudifying apps on social media. That shouldn't be the case. And so there's just so much that's within our control that we're already not doing to prevent those harms that it's a bit easy to say, well, okay, let's just make sure nobody can build any AI app on their own, right? So there's that. And then to your initial point, like right now, the builders who care about doing the right things are not yet empowered to do so with the technical systems they deserve. So let's work on that, right? Let's work on making sure that somebody who don't want their new app to be abused actually can put those safeguards in place. So at a high level, I think there's so much that we can do to tackle all the different parts of these issues.
I mean, it's so fascinating to say that, like, it's not just how does the model work or how does it resolve stuff or everything else, but you're talking about the systemic ways in which the models are deployed and used, that we are running advertising, that we're allowing advertising to run to make profitable businesses on these deepfake porn things, that Apple and Google allow them in the App Store when they won't allow you to publish the Kama Sutra just in text. And so there's like this weird dichotomy going on where it's not the one model, it's not the one thing, it's the systemization of it in a larger ecosystem.
And systemic is exactly the right word, because those sort of cascading failures happen at so many different areas and then sort of get reflected in both proprietary systems and open source systems, right? So another interesting example is those very large databases of images that are used by many AI systems, closed systems, and open systems to train image models. When you talk to the folks who are curating these enormous libraries, sometimes they're in academia, sometimes they're in nonprofits, like they say, we are not getting access to the tools we want and deserve to filter out child sexual abuse materials from these extraordinarily important underlying bits of databases that are used in so many different places of the stack. The cascading failure of that is immense, right? So if you make sure that the tools that the people want and deserve are accessible, are free, are robust, you can also help tackle these risks at very different areas of the stack, not just at the application level, right? You can help people create better databases for the rest of the AI ecosystem too.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And, that we don't have, or I'm not aware of, really good shared ways in which you can sort of red team these things. Like if you have an open model, if you have an open service, and you are Anthropic or you're OpenAI or Google, you can pay for that work to be done and you can check what you're doing and they do things. But if you're building it on your own or contributing this open source project, we don't have those resources. But that's so interesting about talking about different levels of the stack. The internet itself is designed as a multi-layer thing. You have the hardware and then you have low-level routing and higher-level routing, and eventually you get the app that you can see or the web page. What can Roost or other people in the space do, interventions at the level you're not seeing, to make the world a better place? Or what should we be demanding that isn't just like, oh, I can see a kid talked about self-harm and the AI didn't respond in the right way.
Yeah. That
is the symptom, and the cause of it is much deeper down.
The cause of it is much deeper down. And it's not about what Roost can do, because at the core of it, like Roost is a collective, right? And so the thing we can hope for is to create a platform where people can come together and collaborate. And on some of these gnarly issues, what we have is also a systemic failure of collaboration across different disciplines and areas of expertise. And so in your example, for instance, of self-harm and kids, really the type of expertise that you need together, focused on the same place, are often real clinical and medical experts with a background on mental health, auditing systems in the open, right? To your point, doing some red teaming on like, oh, here's an open safeguard, here's what we tried, here's what we learned, and then people being able to iterate on that. And so if you create those shared places, at Roost, and elsewhere, right? Where people can come together and marry their expertise to really audit systems for complex threats and evolve them into more robust defenses. I think this is how we're going to move forward. When we talk to doctors and clinical experts, they say, we see some of this. We hear, what tech companies are trying to do. We have the clinical expertise. We don't have the tech expertise. Tech companies often get some of the clinical expertise in-house, but to your point, then it gets stuck in-house, right? Like the rest of the ecosystem doesn't benefit. And then, of course, because those are very real issues, there are also victims and families who are saying like, well, we would like to ensure this doesn't happen to others. They have context to share. Sometimes they have data to share, and making sure that there are places where people can come together to together make those defenses more robust, I think is what we're after. It will be Roost, and hopefully it will be many other places on different topics too.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. Just how do we do these things? Do we have the solutions inside a few corporations? Do we, these are tools that are different in some ways. I've been thinking a lot about the concern that creators have about their AI licenses. It's my creative work. It gets put into this, authors get put into this thing. And the only way the large language models work is if they have the sum of human creation. Like we need so much data, so many examples to do there, and we put it into these systems and it returns it, and then it creates things that reflect back on ourselves. If we just say, okay, you should pay for the copyright of all this, information you're doing, then it becomes impossibly expensive. It becomes more money than we have in our global economy. And yet it shouldn't just be that a few people could take a copy of all human knowledge and say, we're going to just use it in a private way for our own benefit. And, we get to a question of democracy. Like, who owns these things? Who do we let, if we need all of humanity's knowledge to go into this, why doesn't all of humanity own it? If we create these things that are super intelligence, if it works, how do we protect democracy in these cases? And I know that's a lot of the work that you've done this work with Maria Ressa, and you've tried to figure out how does democracy survive in an era of AI? How do we participate? And your research, and your work in the past has also been, how do we defend, Graphica? How do we defend democracy? How do we defend against authoritarian regimes that don't want a participatory democratic system, don't want a pluralistic society? I think that's a lot of the fear of AI, that we will end up in this weird, technocratic governance of the machines that we don't know how they work. So what do we do?
What do we do to protect democracy, Rebel? That's your question.
Yeah. It's just a little question.
No, it's a fair question. So,
you've been working on it.
Yes, with great success, as you can see.
Yes.
The tech piece is interesting, and it goes back to what you were saying, and I think there is resilience in distributed, transparent systems and strong, empowered ecosystems and communities. I think that's true for many different fields, and making sure that as we, that we can bring these to the fields that need it most, I think is the right focus. Yeah, I would start there. And
I recently had Doug Rushkoff on the podcast, and he talks about Team Human. And he tells this story about a bunch of billionaires who got him together, and they really wanted to know where to go to protect themselves, where to put their bunker when society's collapsing, and how to keep their security guards loyal after money stops being things because there's societal collapse. And his solution is what you talk about, which is the solution isn't some key or running away to the South Island of New Zealand or something like that. But how do we take the benefit of community and bring us together to build better solutions.
Yeah, and I think, when it comes to safety, it's critical because sometimes it's easy to get a little bit of despair when you look at the state of online safety. And a lot of experts will tell you something that is so true, and yet not the end of the road, which is online safety, it's complicated. Undeniable, right? A lot of these issues are very complicated. But then the immediate next step to this is, okay, how do we build the infrastructure that allows us as Team Human to do complicated things together? Because we can. Because we have done this many, many times. And when you face a super hairy, super complicated, multi-dimensional problem that you need a lot of different expertise from people who don't get along and don't have the same incentives to collaborate, that is okay. You take it from here and you think about what is the infrastructure that you need to create for them to be able to come together and collaborate on these problems transparently. And again, Advent says, I like Team Human.
Yeah. I mean, there was a time in which we said that society couldn't run without a monarch having absolute control over it. You just had to base these things on violence and power and monarchy and the idea that they had the divine right of kings to govern society. And then we,
as a French, we had a
yeah.
We had a run at that.
And then a bunch of intellectuals, really French intellectuals, came up with this idea about how to govern society in a different way. And in that case, it took a violent revolution in order to make it happen. But the overthrowing wasn't the transformation. Yeah, no, it was a very messy history. But it wasn't the insurrection that made it happen. Like, it was the work ahead of time of saying, what are the rights of man? What are how do we collaborate? How do we do things? How can we come together and make decisions in a new way? How can we organize society in a new way? What are the technologies of voting? What are the technologies of printing? What are the technologies of the salon where you come and talk to people? Like, we think of technology as like computers and chips or the telephone, but those were all technologies too. The printing press was a really important technology. The systems of public health that let us set up and build a society with different sets of structures that included more of us. And as we see this transformation, how do we include people in that discussion today? I mean, the work you're doing with Roost is that. The work you're doing talking to people, the work you're doing with governments is doing that. The hope, at least my hope, in what you're doing is you're making trust and safety, you're making the ability to build safer AI systems, build safer social media systems, build tools around this stuff that let us solve these problems together rather than saying the only solution is to rely on a few big companies.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's encouraging here is we see those few big companies doing this work alongside us. And I think that matters for the redistributing of resources too, that matters for transparency and accountability. When OpenAI, for instance, released OSS Safeguard with us, their head of safety systems said, yeah, we believe everybody has a right to study, modify, and use the critical safety systems. I think that's also getting us to a world in which tech companies aren't going to be able to just get by saying, yes, safety is really important, we're building safeguards, and people are going to be like, okay, where are your safeguards? Share them. If you think you have very strong safeguards, now the new normal is go share them with the world, right? And I think I'm excited to see that some of those very large tech companies are also with us, helping us build that new normal, where you can't just say, we're investing a lot of money and taking the problem very seriously. You have to show and share your work. And I think that's going to be hopefully beneficial for the future of tech.
That is so important because, there's a trust and safety scandal coming out of Meta every few months. And Meta will do they'll do a war room, they'll get everybody together and they'll come up with a solution. And some of those solutions are actually really good. And they will implement them for a while and they will talk about them. And then sometimes they discover that the solutions don't work, or they get distracted or they move on. And we have no systems of accountability around them. We have no way in which we have their, because they operate outside of the open source ecosystem within this walled garden, even if they're full of well-meaning people and they are full of people who are working really hard on this stuff to try and make it better for their users who really care. We don't have the ways of holding them accountable. We don't have the kinds of government regulation that you would have for an electrical company or car companies that says, okay, how's trust and safety doing this year? Where is the external audit of these things?
And the thing that's fun is when they do some contributions, sometimes those contributions have a long and healthy life, right? So Meta, for instance, a while back, open source, it's actually one of the only pieces of safety tech that they open sourced, but they were very ahead of the others there. They open sourced a piece of safety tech to do hash matching, for instance, on, known CSAMs, a piece called HMA. It's widely used by people. Roost now hosts the office hours for people who want to use HMA. And I think that's the other thing that's in this, which is like, we need to structure the infrastructure for all of these bits and pieces of contribution, because you're right? Like all of these large tech companies, they're not monolith, and they have really talented people who care about safety, including super talented safety engineers who sometimes build things that they're really proud of. When those get open source, making sure that we have the infrastructure for them to be maintained, for them to be interoperable with each other, means that when we do that, they can have very long and successful lives as pieces of software that really shape the world for the best and have a meaningful impact on safety issues. And I'm hoping that the more they see that, the more they'll say, okay, great. Yeah, we will share our favorite parts of our stack, the parts of our stack that we feel the proudest on. Maybe we don't think our rules engine is just there yet, so we'll take the Discord one, but we're really happy with that classifier, and this one we'll share, right?
And it's these big companies that have invested in building this stuff. It's these big, they had the resources, they had the invested. It cost a lot of money to build all these systems.
Yeah.
And we have these big companies open sourcing their databases and their JavaScript frameworks and all these other things. The work you're doing and getting them to open source these other things, they need someone to give it to. Like Discord, when they gave you Osprey for managing these, understanding when bad things are happening systemically on your platform, they needed someone to give it to, and they needed a community to receive it and to maintain it, and someone to say, don't just throw it over the wall, but how do you participate in it? And then
exactly.
They can learn from the open systems.
Yeah, don't throw it just over the walls. When we incubated Roost at Columbia University, we did a long study of what are the frustrations that safety engineers have with regards to the state of tooling? What tools are currently available for people? What do regulators want to see? And then we did a small study of what is already open source safety tool that exists. And it's not that there were no open source safety tools, right? To your point, a few things had been randomly thrown over the wall, but they were totally not interoperable, not maintained, and there was no community around it. But there was something there to start with, which was a sort of good proof that we could continue building on that movement. Osprey is a really fun story in terms of origin story, because Discord used to use a rules engine that was built by a vendor called Smite. And of course, nobody thinks about rules engine in normal life. It's such a sort of intricate piece of safety infrastructure, but it's a really important part of safety infrastructure. You really do need a good rules engine when you have a scaled safety team. And so they were using this vendor called Smite. And then one day, Twitter bought the vendor. And 24 hours later, they unplugged it. And then all the people who were using these vendors were like, oh no, my entire safety infrastructure relies on this. I can't have that. And so the rug got pulled from under their feet. And then the safety engineering team at Discord had to rebuild that thing from scratch. And Clint Smith, who's their in a hurry, right? And then Clint Smith, who's their chief legal officer, who has an open source background, was like, that is an insult to the resilience of the safety ecosystem everywhere. That's just not the way to do things. And again, he looked in other industries, cybersecurity being one of them. And I think that sort of experience from Discord was one of the things that led them to say, like, hey, we've gone through this rodeo once, relying on a piece of infrastructure that just got pulled from under us. We rebuilt it, and this is the one we're sort of donating to the community for resilience, right? Like, that's also the resilience of the safety tapestry of our modern world.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the equivalent of a social media platform shutting down to individual users, or like they're saying you don't get your email account, or you violated some trust and safety rule. Like, as these companies rely on vendors, if the vendors don't contribute to open source, they get acquired, or they run out of money. One of the things that you're doing is you're launching, the content moderation tool, Co-op, and you're taking things from Cove that was a commercial company, and you're making it available to larger people. And it's not just the tech. I mean, that's the thing people get confused about. Open source isn't just the licenses. It isn't just the tech. It's the human network of people who collaborate and make it real and make it alive and work on it. So it's not the technology so much as the humanity of people who come together and collaborate over it that make it an alive thing that actually survives.
Yeah, it's the community, right? It's the ecosystem around it. That being said, the tech is really important. Our CTO comes from Anthropic, where he was leading their safety engineering group. And, he's just making sure that we're not just building for today's problem, but we're future-proofing the commons of safety tech all together with our partners. Our CEO is also fantastic. She used to run the open source office at Google, and she cares about the licenses a whole lot. I think that's also super important, because what we want as we build this commons is tools that people know that they can rely on, right? So when we did the few first launches, we very carefully selected the licenses with our partners, and what they contributed back to the commons is irreversible. They cannot claw it back. If you have a right to go, to use, to modify, to study, to redistribute those tools, that's part of what makes it resilient. If tomorrow Roost disappears, the tools continue to exist without us. If the people who donated those tools change their mind, too bad. The tool's out now. And we care a lot about making sure that, again, tech is super resilient, and also the ways in which it's shared really fully enable people to contribute, to trust them, and then to maintain and to make that commons evolve.
That work is so important, and I'm so glad that you're out there, and I'm so thankful for the work you're doing. I'm very appreciative, because we're using these tools at Divine, and
I'm excited
it
for
means
that.
we can contribute. As an open source company, we can use open source tools. We need these kind of things to work. As we wrap up, is there anything else you want to say that sort of is useful for people trying to understand this, especially a less technical audience, understand what we're doing, building a commons of trust and safety technology, of looking at the future of AI? How do we make it ours? How do we make it safer for all of us?
Yeah, I think that a lot of different people have a say and a stake in it. I think sometimes we live under the impression that only large platforms need safety tools and only engineers will contribute back. But when we hosted the hackathon, we saw a lot of also subject matter experts and policy experts, or people who care about a certain topic, be welcome in these spaces and be shown, like, these are the tools, this is how they're documented, and making sure that they too feel like they have a stake. They are owed a right to transparency. Their voice also matters as subject matter experts. People who care about something is also, I think, how we do this collectively. This is not purely technical side project for platforms. This is a commons for everybody, in which I'm hoping everybody will find its voice and stake. And I'm very excited to see you use these tools. And I was talking about the team. We also have a formidable head of product, Juliet, who I know is working with your team to make sure you have everything you need as you integrate. We're also committed to making sure that people can integrate those tools, and as they face new problems and new questions, we're excited to make that commons grow with everybody and to ensure that it, again, adapts to the different needs of many different users.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebel.
Thanks again to Camille François for coming on Revolution.Social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan from Flock Marketing.
To learn more about the Social Media Bill of Rights and sign up for email newsletter, visit Revolution.Social.
For more interviews like this one, follow Revolution.Social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Nostos, Fountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatistas Subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.